always thought the strangest thing about dying would be the moment it happens, that final breath. The lights going out. The sudden end. But what if I told you the strangest part came before any of that? Before I even knew I was on the edge of leaving this world? What if I told you something was already whispering to me, hours before my heart stopped beating? Something deep in my spirit trying to get my attention. It didn't come with thunder or flashing lights. It came in quiet, in silence, in the kind of stillness that feels too heavy to be normal. That morning, I woke up early, just like I always did. My joints were stiff, same as usual. I brewed my coffee, like I had done every day for the past 40 years. The smell of that dark roast filled my little apartment as sunlight peeked through the blinds. The radio was humming low with soft gospel music, and I remember humming along to a tune I hadn't heard since my childhood. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. And yet, something felt off. Something I couldn't name. I stood by the window and watched the world move without my neighbors heading out. Birds flitting past, wind rustling the trees. But it all looked quiet. Not peaceful, not calm. Empty. Like the world was holding its breath. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just tired. I'd been feeling more exhausted lately. Not the kind of tired that a nap fixes. The kind that sits in your bones. The kind that makes you wonder if your body knows something you don't. Still, I shook it off. I had things to do. I had bills to drop off, groceries to pick up, and I needed to get to the bank before the line wrapped around the building, like it always did on Tuesdays. I dressed slow, like always, buttoned up my cardigan, and walked out into the cool morning air. And that's when the second thing happened. I smelled something. Not something bad, but something old, ancient. It wasn't from a flower or someone's kitchen. It smelled like incense, like something from a church in the mountains, smoky and sacred. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. People were going about their day, talking, walking, driving past. But I just stood there on the sidewalk, frozen, because I could feel it now. Something was watching me. Not a person. Not anything I could point at. But something was there. It didn't feel evil, but it didn't feel safe either. It felt like standing in front of a door you didn't even know was there. And somehow, it had just cracked open. I felt like I was being measured. I tried to brush it off. I really did. Old women get weird feelings all the time, I told myself. We're always reading too deep into signs and dreams. That's what folks say, right? But something deep down wouldn't let go of me. I made it to the bus stop and sat on the bench, watching the world like it was a movie I'd seen 100 times. Same man jogging by with his headphones. Same delivery driver late and speeding. Same teenage girl scrolling on her phone with a face full of boredom. But none of it felt real. It felt like the world was a stage, and the actors were tired of pretending. As the bus pulled up, a woman I had never seen before got off and passed me. She looked me straight in the eyes. Not a casual glance, no, a polite nod. She looked through me, like she knew. Like she saw something on me I couldn't see myself. Her lips didn't move, but I swear to you, I heard words rise up in my spirit like a whisper. It's almost time. My heart skipped. I blinked. She was already gone. Just melted into the crowd. I sat there gripping my purse tight, my knuckles pale, my stomach tight like I'd swallowed a brick. Something was wrong, but not the kind of wrong you call the doctor for. This was the kind of wrong you pray about, the kind you light a candle for, the kind your grandmother warned you about but couldn't explain in words. I wish I could tell you I turned back, that I stayed home, But I didn't. I got on that bus, rode it to the bank, smiled at the teller, bought my groceries, and went through the motions like nothing was happening. But deep down, I knew. I knew. The countdown had already started. Something had already been set in motion. And though I didn't know how or when, I felt it wrapping itself around me, inch by inch, pulling me towards something I couldn't stop. Something that would take me beyond the veil of this world and into the arms of the next. I don't know how long I sat on that bus before it happened. The whole ride felt like a dream, like I was floating through a world that didn't know I was already slipping away from it. People came and went, conversations buzzed around me, the hum of the engine mixed with the city's rhythm, but I wasn't really there. I clutched my purse tight to my lap and stared out the window, but I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't shake that feeling, that weight in my chest. Not pain, yet just pressure. Like something inside me was being squeezed. I remember thinking, this doesn't feel like anxiety. I've had anxiety before. This was something else. Something deeper. Something more final. When I finally got off the bus, the sun was a little higher in the sky, and the world looked too bright. The light had a strange glare to it, like everything was just a bit too sharp, too loud. I squinted and made my way across the street, clutching the plastic handles of my grocery bags, trying to move fast even though my legs felt like they were filled with wet sand. Every step felt heavier than the last, like I was walking through water, like my body was carrying something it couldn't name. I thought I just needed rest, that maybe I hadn't eaten enough. I told myself all kinds of things to explain it away. But the truth was, something had already started inside of me and it was getting stronger by the minute. I made it home, sat down in my favorite chair and tried to breathe. That's when I noticed me chest was tight. Not just heavy anymore, tight, like a fist was pressing into me, slow and steady. I reached for a glass of water, but my hand was trembling. I could barely hold it. My fingers didn't feel like mine. The water spilled a little, and I remember watching the droplets run down the side of the glass like time itself was melting. That's when the pain hit. It wasn't a sharp stab. It was deep, slow, like something was crushing me from the inside out. I grabbed my chest, and a wave of heat ran through my whole body. Not fever, heat, soul heat. It felt like my spirit was trying to separate itself from my skin, like it knew it couldn't stay much longer. I stood up, tried to walk, but my knees buckled. I fell forward, landing hard on the floor, my cheek pressed against the cold tile, my heart pounding like a drum that had lost its rhythm. I remember the sound of my own breath, shallow, gasping, desperatined, and I knew, without any doctor or test or machine, that I was dying. But then, something strange happened. In the middle of that chaos, that pain, that panic, everything started to slow down. Not just in my body. The world around me shifted. The colors faded. The edges of my vision softened. The buzzing refrigerator, the ticking clock, the passing cars, outside, all of it faded into a kind of quiet I'd never known before. The kind of quiet you don't hear with your ears. The kind that feels like velvet in your spirit. My limbs stopped fighting. My body went still. And instead of fear, there was peace. That's what people never tell you about dying. That when it really starts, the fear leaves. Not because you're brave, not because you're ready, but because something bigger than you steps in and takes over. I felt warm, light. I wasn't floating, not yet. But I felt like the weight of my entire life had just lifted off my shoulders. The regrets, the worries, the pain, all of it, gone. Like someone had wiped a slate clean and whispered, "You can rest now." I didn't see flashing lights or hear harps or angels at that moment. What I did feel was the slow detachment of myself from this world. It was subtle, like a thread being pulled gently from a tapestry. At first, I didn't realize what was happening. I thought maybe I was slipping into unconsciousness. But then, I opened my eyes and saw myself lying there on the floor, still, motionless. My chest no longer rising, my eyes half closed. And yet, I was watching it. Not through a mirror, not through a dream. I was looking down at my own body from somewhere above it. Panic should have hit me. Confusion should have swept over me. But none of that came. I wasn't scared. I wasn't sad. I didn't feel any connection to the shell below me. It was like watching an old coat lying on the ground after you've taken it off. Familiar, yes, but not needed anymore. I looked around the room, and everything seemed bathed in a soft glow. The walls shimmered faintly. The corners breathed gently. Time had stopped ticking. I was no longer inside of it. I was in something else. Something that made the world feel small. I heard sounds then, but not from outside, from somewhere deeper. Voices, faint and distant, echoing through my soul. Not English, not any language I could name, but I understood them perfectly. They weren't calling to me. They were calling for me. And then, something pulled me. Not with hands, not with force, but with love. Pure, powerful love that gripped the center of my being and started to draw me upward. I didn't fight it. I couldn't. I didn't want to. Whatever was happening, wherever I was going, it felt right. I looked one last time at my body, at the life I had known, the pictures on the wall, the Bible on the nightstand, the half-empty cup of tea on the table, and I whispered, not with lips, but with my heart, goodbye. Then I turned toward the light that had begun to open in the distance, and I followed it. At first, the light was faint, just a soft glimmer in the distance, like a single star on a cloudy night. But as I moved toward it, the light grew stronger. Not in a way that hurt my eyes, but in a way that seemed to pull something from deep inside me. It wasn't just a light you could see, it was a light you could feel. It called out to parts of me I didn't even know existed, like a long-forgotten melody suddenly remembered, and I wasn't walking toward it. I wasn't flying. I was being drawn, as if the very center of who I was recognized that light as home. The space I was in wasn't darkness exactly, but it wasn't light either. It was like a realm between realms, like standing between two curtains before they're pulled open. There was no ground beneath me, yet I never felt like I was falling. There was no air, yet I could breathe not with lungs, but with spirit. Every movement felt natural, as if I was gliding on purpose and peace. I wasn't afraid, not once. That feeling I had on Earth of time slipping away, of death wrapping its arms around me, had been replaced by something so profound. I don't even know if the word peace does it justice. It was like being remembered by the universe. As I moved closer to the light, I noticed something strange. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of presence, full of memory. I could feel people, not see them, not hear them, but feel them beings all around me, watching, waiting, praying me forward. Their love wrapped around me like warm blankets fresh from the dryer. They weren't strangers. I knew them. I didn't know how, but I knew. Some had been gone from the earth long before I was born. Others, I sensed, had walked with me in ways I had never understood until now. They were witnesses, not judging, not speaking, just holding space. And then came the sound. Not like any sound you hear with your ears, but a tone that passed straight through my soul. It was music and heartbeat and thunder all at once, resonating deep inside me, vibrating through the very essence of who I was. It was alive. It felt ancient, like it had existed before the first sunrise, and it was leading me forward. I remember thinking that if I could just get closer to the source of that sound, I'd never want for anything again. Not love, not purpose, not peace. It would all be there. Complete, whole, eternal. And that's when the air, or what felt like air, began to shift. It grew warmer, thicker, more electric. The kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room where people have been praying for hours. The kind of feeling where your spirit knows to be still. I could feel it before I saw him. I could feel his presence, the way you feel sunlight on your skin. Heavy, but not oppressive. Powerful, but not forceful. Pure. He didn't announce himself. There was no booming voice, no dramatic entrance. He was simply there. I stopped moving, though I never took a step. He didn't speak, but I heard him. Not with ears, with everything. My heart, my mind, my soul. He called my name. Not as the world knew it, but as heaven did. And when I heard it, when I truly heard who I was, I wept. Not out of sadness, not even out of joy. I wept because in that one moment, I remembered. I remembered where I came from. I remembered the part of me that had been asleep all my life. He didn't need to tell me who he was. I knew. Every cell of my being knew. Every lifetime I had ever lived, every prayer I had ever whispered, every tear I had ever cried, all of it rose up in that one instant and recognized the one standing before me. Jesus. He didn't look like the paintings in the churches. He didn't look like the versions folks argue over. His face was too radiant for details. His skin shimmered with something beyond color. His eye saw. His eye shelled galaxies. They held the beginning and the end, and somehow, me. He looked at me, and I saw everything I'd ever been laid bare. Every mistake, every regret, every hurt I'd buried deep down and hoped he wouldn't see. And yet, I never felt shame. Not for 1 second. His eyes didn't condemn. They understood. They didn't scold. They healed. He stepped forward, not with footsteps, but with lightened. The moment he came closer, I could feel all the broken places in me begin to knit back together. The wounds I'd carried in silence. The betrayals I never told anyone about. The quiet griefs that lived in my bones. They were being seen. And not just seen, they were being restored. He lifted a hand, and with that one gesture, my entire life unfolded in front of us. Not like a film, not like a book, but like an understanding. Every choice, every fear, every act of love, every failure. It was all there. And through it all, he remained steady, present, loving. He spoke again, and his words wrapped around me like a second skin. He said, "You are not here by mistake." And those words sank deeper than any sermon I'd ever heard. Because in that moment, I realized how much of my life I had spent questioning my worth, my purpose, my suffering. And he answered it all in 5 words. You are not here by mistake. Not just May, but all of us. Every single one of us. Seen, known, designed with purpose. Even when the world made us feel like accidents. Tears fell not down my cheeks, but from the deepest part of who I was. I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because I'd never felt so whole, and I knew deep in my core that this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something I had never imagined. something that would shake everything I thought I knew about the world. Jesus hadn't called me there just to comfort me in death. He had something to show me, something the world had buried, something that was about to change everything. There are no human words that can truly describe what it feels like to stand in the presence of Jesus. All I can do is try. Being with him was like standing inside the heartbeat of the universe. Like every single part of creation, from the mountains to the oceans, from the stars to the sparrows, was connected to that one pulsing light that came from him. And yet, in all of that power, that eternal majesty, there was nothing intimidating about him. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel unworthy. I felt known, completely and perfectly known. Like he saw every page of my story and loved me for all of its mistakes, and all. The light around him didn't shine on things the way sunlight does. It shone through them, through me, through time itself. When he looked at me, it was like I wasn't just me anymore. I was every version of myself. The little girl crying alone in the kitchen, the teenager who didn't know how to ask for help, the young mother terrified she wasn't enough, the aging woman hiding her pain behind strength. He saw all of it at once, and somehow he loved all of it equally. There was no shame, no guilt, no sense of, why didn't you do better? There was only understanding, mercy, and a kind of compassion that cracked me open from the inside out. He didn't have to say anything. His presence alone answered the questions I'd been carrying my whole life. Why did I suffer? Why did some people leave too soon? Why did I feel invisible for so many years? And the answer wasn't a list of reasons. It wasn't a long explanation. It was simply him. His presence was the answer. His presence was peace. Every wound I'd ever tried to ignore, every ache I buried, every silent prayer I whispered when no one was around it had reached him. It had always reached him. I just hadn't known it. He began to walk the light around him moved, and without words, I understood that I was to follow. As I moved with him, the space we were in began to shift. The surroundings became something new, yet ancient. I saw fields without end, but not made of grass, or flowers made of something living, glowing with light and music and memory. I could hear the songs of souls that had come before me. Songs of praise, songs of lament, songs of longing, but none of them were mournful. Even the pain carried in those songs felt holy, redeemed, and I felt the weight of generations, as if the prayers of ancestors were still alive in the air itself. Then, without warning, I was standing in a place that defied everything I thought I understood about time or space. It was a kind of corridor, but not one made of stone or wood. It was made of light and motion, and it stretched on forever. It pulsed with warmth, like it was breathing, like it was alive. This was not a tunnel of death, it was a path of revelation. And I knew, somehow, that I was not the first to walk it. Many had come through here. Some I would never know by name. Others were people we speak of in hushed tones, prophets, visionaries, those who had seen behind the veil and come back with fire in their bones. I felt their presence all around me, watching, guiding, hoping I would listen, hoping I would remember. I looked at Jesus. He nodded, and suddenly, the sides of the corridor began to fill with movement. They weren't walls. They were records, stories, lives, images that danced like firelight and whispered truths into my soul. I saw my own life again, not just the big moments, but the little ones. Moments I had forgotten, moments I thought were meaningless. A kind word to a stranger, a prayer said in exhaustion, a time I forgave someone who never apologized. And Jesus showed me that none of it was wasted. Every act of love had echoed in eternity. And then came the shift. The corridor faded, and the space around us opened, wide, massive, infinite. I was no longer in a tunnel. I was standing at the edge of something I cannot fully explain. It was a place of waiting, but also of knowing. A place where truths too heavy for earth could be held in the open, where things that had been hidden were laid bare, not to shame, but to awaken. I felt it in my bones. This was where he was going to show me something I had never been taught, something I had never even known to ask. The light pulsed again, and Jesus looked at Menno as a teacher about to give a lesson, but as a friend about to share a burden. His eyes were filled with a sorrow I didn't understand at first. But beneath that sorrow was love. Fierce, unstoppable love. The kind of love that would tear down mountains for the sake of truth. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he turned, and the space around us began to change once more. What I was about to see, I knew, would not just change me. It would call me to speak, to return, to carry what I saw back to a world that had forgotten who it really was. And so I stood there, on the edge of that revelation, ready and unready at the same time. My spirit trembling, but my heart open. Because when Jesus reveals a truth, you don't look away. You can't. All you can do is receive it and let it burn everything false to the ground. The moment he lifted his hand, I felt everything around me begin to shift again. But this time, it wasn't gentle. It was powerful, like standing in the middle of a wave you can't see, but can feel rushing through your soul. The space around us cracked open, not with sound, not with destruction, but with revelation. It was as if a curtain was being pulled back on the deepest truth the world had forgotten. And then, suddenly, I was no longer standing with Jesus in that place between realms. I was standing over land. Vast, rich, beautiful land. And the land was alive, glowing, breathing. Africa. But not the Africa I had ever seen on TV or read about in school books. This wasn't the starving child version. This wasn't the war-torn, poverty-stricken image the world feeds us. No, this was ancient, sacred, whole. The sky stretched wide and golden, not blue. And the earth below shimmered like it had memory. The rivers sparkled with something more than water. The trees stood tall like guardians, and the air was thick not with heat, but with wisdom. And there were cities, glorious, intricate cities, built not of crumbling stone, but of structure and light, with patterns too divine for modern minds to recreate. These weren't primitive people. These weren't lost tribes. These were kingdoms, civilizations, built on truth, on connection, on spiritual knowledge passed from one generation to the next. I saw people walking tall, proud, radiant, men and women of dark skin, eyes full of light, adorned in garments that pulsed with energy and purpose. They moved with grace, with intention, with a rhythm that echoed through time. Then I heard his voice again, and though he spoke quietly, the words struck like thunder in my bones. They were chosen, and I felt it. Not just in my ears, not just in my chest. I felt it in every part of me that had ever wondered why the world seemed to fear the power of blackness. Why truth had been buried so deep. Why history had been rewritten. Jesus said, "The world has lied about them." And when he said them, I knew exactly who he meant. Black people, African people, descendants spread across the earth, disconnected from their roots, walking through life beneath the weight of a deception that had lasted for centuries. The vision changed again. The golden light dimmed, and suddenly I was watching ships massive, grotesque ships scudding through ocean waves. The air grew heavy, bitter, full of cries and chains. I saw bodies packed into the belly of boats like cargo, stripped of their names, their languages, their customs. I saw children torn from mothers, husbands pulled from wives, spirits screaming in silence. But it wasn't just human cruelty. Behind the suffering, I saw shadows. Dark, slithering forces that fed on pain, on confusion, on separation. I saw hands that weren't human guiding empires, whispering lies into the ears of kings, twisting scripture, rewriting history. It wasn't just greed or racism or ignorance. It was something spiritual, something ancient, something deliberate. Jesus looked at me again. His face carried sorrow that made my knees buckle. They tried to erase them, he said, not just from the earth, but from memory, from spirit, from purpose. The vision zoomed closer. I saw schools teaching falsehoods, churches painting prophets with pale skin, media mocking or silencing black voices unless they served a certain narrative. I saw names of great leaders buried, inventions stolen, identities stripped and replaced with caricatures. But worst of all, I saw a mirror, and in that mirror, I saw black children looking at their reflection, already believing they were less. Not because of what anyone said directly, but because of what the world never showed them. The absence of truth was its own kind of violence. And yet, even in that sorrow, I felt something else rising. The vision shifted again. I saw modern cities, streets full of movement, and I saw people beginning to wake up. I saw a young black woman reading a book she wasn't taught in school, her eyes wide with fire. I saw a teenage boy kneeling in prayer, asking God to show him who he really was. I saw elders sharing stories that had been whispered through generations, now being spoken aloud with pride. I saw groups gathering, not in protest, but in reclamation. And the shadows? They started to scatter. They hissed and fought, but they couldn't hold back what was rising. Truth, identity, purpose. Jesus turned to me again. They were never forgotten, he said. Heaven remembers. Heaven has always remembered. And then he touched my shoulder, and in an instant, I felt it. I felt the songs of ancestors still echoing in the soil. I felt the drumbeats that had once summoned rain and cast out illness. I felt the wisdom of midwives, warriors, priests, queens, inventors, poets, builders. I felt generations who had prayed through pain, sung through suffering, danced through despair. And I understood something that shook me to my core. They had survived not just because they were strong, but because they were chosen, protected, held, covered by God, even when the world tried to convince them otherwise. Jesus whispered again, this time, so softly, I had to still every part of myself to hear it. The world feared their power. That is why it worked so hard to break them. He didn't say it with pride. He said it with pain, but also with hope. Because he wasn't just showing me what had been. He was showing me what would be. I saw a rising, not a rebellion, but a return to truth, to memory, to divine inheritance. I saw black people everywhere, stepping back into their rightful place, not above others, but no longer beneath. I saw them leading, teaching, healing, not because they sought to conquer, but because they had remembered. And when you remember who you are, the world cannot keep you small. And then Jesus looked at me with a seriousness that felt like a command burned into my spirit. They must know, he said. You must tell them, it is time. I nodded, trembling. Because I knew that once this truth was seen, it could never be unseen. Once this message was spoken, it could never be silenced. The lie was old, but the truth was older, and now the time had come for it to rise again. The light began to shift again, but this time it grew dim, not because the presence of God was leaving, but because something was being shown to me that required a deeper kind of seeing. Jesus was still beside me, his presence unwavering. But now, the vision turned toward pain, toward suffering, toward a truth too many have been too afraid to face. I saw chains thick, iron, cold, and I saw them being wrapped around wrists, ankles, necks. I saw men and women forced into darkness, forced to march across burning sands and wooden decks, stripped of everything but the breath in their lungs, their names, their languages, their faith, torn from them, systematically, deliberately. I saw hundreds of them lined up like a machine designed not just to enslave bodies, but to erase identity. Every movement of those ships was powered by lies. Lies that said these people were less, that they were uncivilized, that they were unworthy of the same dignity, the same divine spark. And yet, as I looked deeper, I saw what the world could not see. I saw the light still burning within them. Dimmed, yes, but never extinguished. That light was the truth. The truth that no matter how much pain they endured, they still carried something unshakable within them, a divine inheritance that could never be stolen, only hidden. The vision moved forward in time. I saw fields, cotton, sugar, tobacco, and I saw backs bent under the sun, hands blistered and bleeding, souls exhausted from centuries of labor. I heard the whip crack. I heard cries to heaven that shook the earth. And I saw those same spiritual forces lurking behind the scenes, whispering into the ears of those in power, feeding greed, feeding pride, feeding systems that would span generations. This wasn't just about power or money. It was about suppressing a people whose spiritual authority posed a threat to the very structures the enemy had built. Because if Black people remembered who they truly were, remembered the power they carried in their blood, in their bones, the world as we know it would be forced to change. I watched as generations passed. Slavery ended, but the chains did not disappear. They simply changed shape. Laws replaced shackles. Schools taught silence instead of truth. Churches preached salvation but erased identity. I saw how even faith, the very thing meant to free people, had been weaponized to control. Scripture twisted. Images altered. Whole doctrines built not to liberate, but to dominate. I saw preachers stand behind pulpits, some knowing, some blind, but all reinforcing a message that told Black people they were cursed, less than, outsiders. And yet again, I looked deeper. And I saw something the enemy couldn't stop. A flame, passed from mother to child, from father to son, through prayer, through song, through suffering. That flame never went out. Jesus turned to me then, his eyes heavy with grief, and he said, "The oppression was not just physical, it was spiritual." I felt those words ripple through me like a storm. This wasn't just about stolen land or broken bodies. This was about stolen truth, about what happens when a people are disconnected from their origin, from their creator, from the lineage of power they were born into. He showed me schools teaching history with whole chapters missing, textbooks that started in slavery and ignored everything that came before, entire cultures reduced to footnotes. And in doing so, something precious had been buried, not just information, but identity. When you erase who someone was, you confuse who they are. And when they are confused, they are easier to control. I saw the impact of this deception. I saw children growing up with no mirror that showed them their beauty. I saw teenagers searching for purpose in a world that constantly told them they were a problem. I saw adults working twice as hard for half the reward, carrying invisible weights of generational trauma. I saw churches where they shouted hallelujah but carried quiet shame, wondering why they always felt like guests in a kingdom that had always been theirs. And all the while, those spiritual forces continued their work-sowing division, promoting confusion, blocking access to truth. But then, I saw something shift. Something small, at first. A crack in the system. A child asking questions their teacher couldn't answer. A pastor breaking away from tradition to seek the Holy Spirit for himself. A grandmother telling stories that had never been written down. These were ember sparks and, one by one, they began to ignite. I saw groups forming, some in secret, others bold and loud, people beginning to reclaim what had been taken. Not just history, but their voice, their relationship with God, their ancestral memory, their calling. Jesus raised his hand and pointed, and I saw black men and women praying with power that made the heavens tremble. I saw healing pouring from their hands. I saw visions being received, gifts being restored. Not because someone gave them permission, but because heaven had always said yes. The authority was never lost. It had only been buried under centuries of lies, and now it was rising. Rising not to dominate, but to liberate. And not just black people, but all who had been blinded by falsehood. Because this awakening wasn't about one group being above another. It was about restoring the truth for everyone. But it had to begin where the lie had struck hardest. Jesus looked at me again and said, "When they remember, the world will shift." And in that moment, I saw it. I saw black people walking in full knowledge of their worth, not the kind given by governments or systems or movements, but worth given by God himself. I saw them speaking, leading, prophesying, building, and healing not for power, but for purpose. And as they rose, others followed. I saw unity, not uniformity, but divine alignment. Different people, different nations, all finding their place in God's design because one people had dared to wake up and remember who they truly were. And as the vision faded, I wept. Because I knew this wasn't history. This was prophecy. And it had already begun. The vision shifted once more. But this time, it didn't take me backward into history or suffering. It moved forward. Forward into a time that was already unfolding on earth. A time of awakening. I could feel it in my spirit before I saw anything with my eyes, a stirring, a shaking, like the ground beneath the world's feet was beginning to rumble with a truth too powerful to remain buried. Jesus stood beside me in that holy stillness, and I knew something was coming. Not destruction, not vengeance, but remembrance. And it was happening through the very people the world had once tried to silence. All around me, I began to see flashes, scenes opening like windows in the sky. A young man kneeling beside his bed in a dark room, hands lifted in surrender, tears on his cheeks as he whispered, "God, show me who I really am." He wasn't just praying for strength. He was praying for identity. Then I saw a woman, middle-aged, tired from years of working and being overlooked, standing in her kitchen with the Bible open, reading a verse she'd read 100 times before. But this time, the words lit up in her heart like fire, and she gasped because she knew something had shifted. Something had begun to rise inside her that she couldn't explain. It wasn't pride. It wasn't ego. It was power. A power she didn't learn from the world, but one that had always been hers. I saw children learning history their textbooks never taught. I saw families gathering in homes to pray and to talk, not just about faith, but about lineage, about destiny. I saw elders opening their mouths to share stories they had once been told, to forget stories that stretched back centuries, stories full of pain, yes, but also full of God's presence, God's favor, God's promise. And every time one of these stories was spoken aloud, a chain broke, a lie shattered, a veil lifted. Jesus showed me people reclaiming their voices, not just shouting in protest, but declaring in purpose. I saw Black preachers no longer mimicking traditions handed down from colonized pulpits, but stepping into a deeper, more ancient truth that pulsed with the same spirit that moved in Moses, in Miriam, in David, in Deborah. Their sermons were no longer performances. They were portals, gateways, through which heaven poured out, and people began to remember. Not just who they were in Christ, but who they were before the world tried to rename them. And it wasn't just in churches. I saw it in classrooms, in courtrooms, in music studios, in science labs. I saw Black inventors, educators, doctors, artists, stepping into callings that had been dimmed by generations of pressure, but never extinguished. The vision grew louder, the colors brighter, like the earth itself was responding to their awakening. And I understood this wasn't just a cultural shift. It was a spiritual movement. Heaven wasn't just watching. Heaven was cheering. Then I saw something that nearly took my breath away. I saw people dancing. Not the kind of dancing that entertains, but the kind that heals. Dancing with movements that had been passed down in dreams. Movements that unlocked memory. Movements that broke curses. These dancers were covered in light, surrounded by angels. And as they danced, I saw the earth beneath their feet begin to bloom. Literal flowers and fruit rising from dust. It was as if creation itself had been waiting for them to step back into their role, their authority, their original design. Jesus looked at me again, and this time his eyes burned not with anger, but with a holy fire, a righteous intensity. "They are rising," he said, "and nothing can stop it now." I wept, not from sadness, but from awe, because I knew that every moment of suffering, every forced silence, every generational wound had been seen, had been recorded. And now finally the scales were tipping, not toward revenge, but toward restoration. And it didn't stop with the individual. I saw nations being shaken, institutions breaking under the weight of long-hidden truth. I saw young leaders standing before crowds, their words laced with divine wisdom, not because of degrees or status, but because they were speaking from the Spirit, because God had poured into them what no university ever could. They weren't asking for permission to lead. They were answering a call that had echoed through centuries. I saw people returning to spiritual practices that had been demonized or forgotten. Not witchcraft, not superstition, but sacred knowledge. Ways of connecting with the Creator that predated colonization, that had been passed down from generation to generation under the breath of prayers, hidden in lullabies, sealed in the marrow of bones. And as they embraced these truths, I saw healing, not just of bodies, but of bloodlines. Families restored, fathers coming back to their children, mothers standing tall again. Whole communities being reborn from ashes the world thought would never bring life again. And in the middle of it all, Jesus whispered one word: prophecy. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't coincidence. It was prophecy fulfilled, a long-awaited turning of the tide. The enemy had tried to delay it, distort it, drown it in distraction and doubt, but it had arrived. The people who had been told they were less were stepping into their more. The ones who were once counted out were now being counted on. And as their voices rose, the heavens answered. I saw angels dispatched. I saw miracles multiplying. I saw doors opening that no man could shut. And as I stood there, watching this great awakening unfold, I felt a quiet voice stir in my spirit, not from Jesus this time, but from within me, a voice that had been there all along, waiting. It said, "This is why you were shown. This is why you were sent back. Because this awakening couldn't just happen silently. It had to be spoken. It had to be shared. It had to be witnessed." And an old woman who thought her time had passed was being called to speak it into the world, to fan the flames, to remind anyone who would listen that now is the time to rise. The truth had waited long enough, and it was no longer knocking gently. It was breaking through, loud, unapologetic, glorious. And the world would never be the same. When I opened my eyes back in that hospital room, everything felt wrong. Not because of pain, not because of confusion, but because I had just seen something so holy, so eternal. And now I was back in a place that felt small and artificial. The bright fluorescent lights stung my eyes. The beeping machines jabbered like nonsense. Nurses bustled around, talking fast, checking charts, doing what they were trained to do. But none of them knew where I had just been. They were focused on blood pressure and heart rate and oxygen levels, but my mind wasn't in that bed. My soul was still with Jesus, still hearing his words echo through my spirit. They are rising. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had been sent back for a reason, not for comfort, not for recovery, but for purpose. Family came in crying, holding my hands, praising God that I had made it, but none of them truly understood that part of me hadn't come back the same. I wasn't just someone who'd survived a medical emergency. I had stood in the presence of divine truth, watched centuries unfold in front of me like a tapestry being unrolled by heaven itself. And now I was supposed to just go on living like everything was normal. I couldn't. I didn't know how. For days I barely spoke. Not because I was in shock, but because I didn't know how to speak about something so heavy, so powerful, and so sacred. I kept hearing that voice whispering in my soul. They must know. The doctors said I was lucky, that it was a miracle I had survived. And they were right. But they had no idea the true miracle wasn't that my heart started beating again. The miracle was what I had seen on the other side. And yet, I was terrified. How do you start a conversation like that? How do you explain to people that Jesus himself showed you the truth about Black people, about their stolen identity, about the divine inheritance they've been walking around with and didn't even know it? I tried to tell my sister one night, just the beginning, just a whisper of it. Her eyes softened with pity. She squeezed my hand and said I must have had a beautiful dream. She meant well, but she didn't believe me. That stung worse than I expected. It wasn't rejection, it was erasure. It was the same kind of silence the world had always used to bury truth. People think the hardest part of being given a revelation is the burden of carrying it. But I'm here to tell you, it's not. The hardest part is speaking it and watching people look at you like you're crazy. I thought maybe the church would understand. Surely, if I told them that Jesus had spoken to me, they would listen. So I shared it with a few people from my congregation, thinking maybe, just maybe, they would feel what I felt. But the moment I mentioned the truth about Black people being chosen, something changed in their faces. Discomfort, suspicion, fear. One woman said, "Now, sister, you sure that wasn't just symbolic?" Another whispered later, "You should be careful with stories like that. The devil is tricky. that broke me. For a while, I stayed quiet. I told myself it wasn't time, that maybe God would give me another sign. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was afraid. Afraid of being mocked, of being dismissed, of stirring up something I couldn't control. But the visions wouldn't leave me. Every night, when I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of those glowing ancestors. I heard the drums. I felt the rising. And then, one night, while the world slept, and I sat alone in my living room, with the lights off and my Bible open on my lap, I heard the voice again. Clearer this time. Speak. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. It shook me on the inside. I sat there, trembling, tears rolling down my face, because I knew that if I didn't speak, I would be disobeying the very one who had saved me. So I began, quietly at first. I wrote down what I had seen. I recorded a simple voice note, just my story in my own words. I posted it online, not thinking much of it. But within days, it disappeared. Gone. No explanation. I tried again. This time, a video. My face on the screen, sharing how Jesus had shown me the truth, how I had seen the power of Black identity and the spiritual battle behind its erasure. The video uploaded fine, but the next morning, it was gone again. And so were my other files. Entire folders vanished from my computer. My phone started freezing. Strange numbers started calling. But when I answered, there was only breathing. At first I thought I was being paranoid, but the pattern was too specific. It wasn't just resistance, it was sabotage. One night, just as I finished writing another blog post about the spiritual inheritance of Black people, my screen began to flicker. My apartment went cold, ice cold, even though the heater was on. And then I saw it. A shadow moved across the hallway wall. Slow, deliberate. I know what I saw. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a presence. Something dark. Watching. Waiting. I couldn't speak. My voice caught in my throat. I tried to pray, but even the words stuck. And then finally, I forced them out. In the name of Jesus, you have no place here. Leave. And just like that, the shadow vanished. The room warmed. The air cleared. And I knew I was in a war now. Not just a war of ideas, a spiritual war. That night changed everything. I realized this wasn't just about sharing a message. It was about fighting for the truth. Fighting for generations who had been taught to hate their own reflection. Fighting for children growing up without knowing they are heirs to something divine. Fighting for people who pray to a God they believe is distant, when He's been speaking to them all along through their own bloodline, through the prayers of their ancestors. And I knew then, without a doubt, that I couldn't turn back. The moment I said yes to this truth, I said yes to the battle that came with it. So I spoke louder, bolder. I stopped trying to convince and started simply declaring. And something strange happened. At first, the pushback increased. More lost files, more strange glitches, more cold spots in my home. But then the messages started coming in. Quiet at first. People who had seen the video before it was deleted. People who felt something stir in their spirit when they heard my story. They said things like, "I don't know why, but I believe you." Or, "I've always felt there was more to us than what we've been told." That was when I realized something powerful this message wasn't mine to protect. It was already moving, already planting seeds. And the more I shared, the more I began to understand why the enemy had fought so hard to keep this hidden. Because the moment people start remembering who they really are, the systems built on their silence start to fall apart. This was never just about race. It was about spiritual restoration, about returning to a truth so deep, so ancient, that even hell itself had tried to erase it. And now that it had been spoken, it couldn't be stopped. The truth was rising, and I was going to speak it again and again and again, until every ear that needed to hear it did, until every soul that had been searching knew exactly where they came from and who had been walking with them all along. There comes a point when you realize the world will never be what it was before, not because it changed, but because you did. After I embraced what Jesus had shown me, after I said yes to the message and yes to the mission, something in me broke open permanently. I no longer saw things the same. The way people moved, the way systems operated, even the way churches worshipped it, all looked different. Because now, I could see beneath the surface. I could feel the tension between truth and deception woven through every layer of society. It was like being handed a spiritual lens and suddenly realizing how much of the world had been built on illusions. Comforting illusions, carefully crafted ones, but illusions all the same. And then one night, something happened that shook me deeper than anything before. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't even praying. I was just sitting on my couch, reading scripture, letting the quiet fill the room. And then, everything around me shifted, not the furniture, not the walls, but the atmosphere. It was as if the veil between heaven and earth had been peeled back, and my spirit was pulled forward like a thread being tugged by invisible hands. I wasn't in my living room anymore. I was somewhere else entirely. A space without time, without walls, without air. But it wasn't empty. It was charged. Every inch of that place vibrated with purpose. And then the vision came. It came fast, like flashes of lightning, each image brighter and more urgent than the last. I saw fire, not hellfire, but cleansing fire sweeping across cities. I saw rivers rising, swallowing land, storms pounding the ground with a fury that was both terrifying and holy. Earthquakes cracking open soil where there had never been fault lines. Not random disasters, not chaos, but something that felt intentional. A great shaking, a divine interruption. I cried out, "Lord, what is this?" And then Jesus was beside me again, eyes blazing like I'd never seen before. He didn't look angry. He looked resolute, grieved, yes, but focused, strong. And his voice filled that place, not loud, but final. The world must be shaken before it can be restored. Tears welled in my eyes because I understood. We had been warned. We had been nudged. We had been whispered to, tugged at, awakened slowly. But the world had grown deaf, too distracted by comfort, too obsessed with control, too sedated by falsehood. And now, the shaking had begun, not to destroy, but to expose, to bring everything hidden into the light. I saw institutions falling, governments scrambling, religious leaders silenced not by violence, but by truth they could no longer outrun. I saw people who had once held power trying to hold on tighter, using fear, lies, and division like weapons. But they were losing their grip because the people were waking up, especially Black people. They were remembering, and with that remembering came fire. I saw Black prophets stepping onto stages with no notes, no plans, just anointing. I saw healers laying hands and watching sickness flee. I saw mothers praying over their sons and unlocking destinies with nothing but their voice and authority. I saw fathers speaking life into their daughters, planting strength where trauma used to live. I saw teenagers dreaming dreams, and receiving visions that couldn't be explained away. No seminary, no diploma, just God, pure and direct, and the world didn't know what to do with it. Because it wasn't coming through the channels they controlled, it was coming through the bloodlines they tried to erase. Then I saw the enemy respond. Not as a monster, not with fangs and horns, but with distraction, with noise, with false movements, with media campaigns crafted to dilute the message. With new kinds of chains, not iron this time, but digital, mental, emotional. I saw confusion being sown like seeds, some disguised as justice, some wrapped in religion, but all designed to do one thing: stop the awakening. Keep people fighting each other instead of confronting the lies. Keep people looking outward instead of inward. I saw even some believers fall into the trap, using scripture not as a sword of truth, but as a shield against accountability, twisting words to justify silence, to stay comfortable. But despite all of that, the light kept spreading. I saw homes turn into sanctuaries, kitchens becoming altars, families gathering around candles and speaking truths that hadn't been spoken in generations. Not just about God, but about themselves, about where they came from, about the covenant God made with their ancestors that had never been broken, only buried. And I saw something even more miraculous: people of every background beginning to recognize that truth wasn't just for one group. The awakening began with Black people, yes, because the lie had struck them the deepest. But now the ripple was moving outward, touching others, revealing their own forgotten truths, their own distortions. It was like a flood of clarity, washing over the earth. And those who had eyes to see were being swept up in it. Jesus looked at me again, and his voice this time was quiet but firm. The final battle has begun. I didn't need him to explain. I could feel it in my bones. This was not a battle of weapons. It was not a battle of armies. It was a battle of truth versus deception, a battle of spirit versus illusion. I saw people who once mocked the message now on their knees. I saw skeptics crying out for visions. I saw agnostics trembling as dreams visited them at night. And I saw the enemy rage in silence, unable to stop the tide of remembrance. And then, just as quickly, I was back, sitting on my couch, hands trembling, the Bible still open on my lap, but now the words on the page looked different. Not because they changed, but because I had. I sat there for hours, weeping, not from fear, but from reverence, because I knew what I had seen wasn't metaphor. It wasn't symbolic. It was coming, and it had already started. The shaking was already here. The rise was already happening, and I had a choice to make. Not tomorrow, not someday, right now. Would I stay quiet to preserve my comfort? Or would I be a voice in the wilderness, crying out even if no one wanted to listen? And that night, with tears running down my face and fire in my chest, I whispered the only words that mattered. Use me, Lord. I didn't know what it would cost. I didn't know who would turn their back. But I knew one thing, without question: the truth must be spoken, even if it meant standing alone, even if it meant becoming a target. Because once you've seen what I've seen, you can't go back, not ever. And the world. The world is about to witness something they cannot deny. The rising of a people, the collapse of a lie, the roar of a truth that will never be silenced again. I wish I could tell you that once I said yes to God's call, everything became easy, that people gathered around, eager to hear the truth, ready to embrace the revelation Jesus gave me. But that's not what happened. What happened was silence. At first, just that quiet kind of rejection, the way people smile politely while mentally backing away. Then came the skepticism, the subtle mockery dressed up in concerned people, telling me to rest, to take care of myself, to maybe talk to someone about the trauma of what I'd been through. And when I kept speaking, when I wouldn't back down, the silence turned to resistance. Not just from strangers, from family, from the church, from people I had prayed with, cried with, trusted. Some told me flat out that I was being deceived. Others said I was trying to stir up division. But I knew what I saw. I knew who had shown me. I started to see the cost of obedience in ways I hadn't expected. Isolation, loneliness, nights where I sat in the dark, wondering why God would choose someone like me, a woman whose best years, by the world's standards, were behind her to carry a message so heavy, so misunderstood, so threatening to the very systems people had built their comfort around. But then I'd remember his voice. I'd remember that tunnel of light. I'd remember his eyes, full of grief and fire, when he said, "You must tell them." And I'd remember the faces, the glowing ancestors, the children dancing, the cities trembling under the weight of rising truth. I'd remember the storm, the shaking, the promise. I had seen too much to be quiet, and little by little, something began to shift. I started hearing from people who had never spoken up before, strangers reaching out to say, "Your story stirred something in me." Mothers telling me their children were suddenly asking questions about history, about their name, about why they feel things they can't explain. Young people, some who had walked away from God, completely coming back, not because of tradition, but because something in their spirit was being reignited. They didn't want performance, they didn't want rules. They wanted truth, and they could feel that truth calling to them through the chaos. And then, something I never expected happened. I started to see others telling the same story, different voices, different angles, but the same root. They too had seen the veil pulled back. They too had felt that quiet whisper from heaven. It's time. Historians, artists, musicians, teachers, prophets, people from all walks of life waking up with pieces of the same puzzle. And suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. We weren't echoing into a void, we were becoming a chorus, a wave, a movement not led by platforms or institutions, but by the Spirit of the living God. But the opposition didn't stop. In fact, it intensified. The more the truth spread, the more the enemy responded. Not always in obvious ways, not in the old ways. Now it came through subtle distortion, twisting the message, mimicking the movement, diluting the power with distractions and counterfeits. I saw people trying to hijack the awakening for personal gain, trying to turn it into a trend, a brand, a slogan. And I knew what Jesus had warned me was true. The closer we got to the fullness of revelation, the harder the enemy would fight to keep the world blind. Because this awakening isn't just about remembering history, it's about reclaiming authority, about breaking chains that have bound not only people, but entire generations. And the enemy cannot afford for that to happen. But there's one thing the darkness always underestimates. Once the light is lit, once the soul has tasted truth, you cannot return to the lie. Not fully. You might try, you might doubt, but something inside you knows, and that knowing is what this awakening is built on. That knowing is what's driving people to question, to dig, to pray, like they've never prayed before. And for those who've never believed in anything, it's drawing them into encounters they can't explain, dreams they can't ignore, a presence they can't shake. It's happening everywhere, in prisons, in classrooms, in kitchens, in quiet places where God is whispering again. Remember who you are. And now, more than ever, I feel the urgency. I feel it like fire in my bones. I know not everyone will accept this message. Some will run from it. Some will laugh at it. Some will do everything they can to silence it. But others, you are listening. And you didn't come across this by accident. Your soul brought you here. Because deep down, you've felt it too. That tug, that holy unrest, that quiet ache that says, there's more. And I'm here to tell you, there is more. You were born for such a time as this. You carry something inside you that generations have prayed would awaken. You are the answered prayer of those who came before. The fire they carried didn't die, it just waited for you. This message isn't about raising one group above another. It's about setting the record straight, about healing the wound at the root, about restoring the balance heaven intended from the beginning. Black people were targeted not because they were weak, but because they were powerful, because they carried something eternal, and that something is rising again. The enemy knows it. That's why the attacks have been relentless, but the gates of hell will not prevail against what God has ordained. Not this time. So, if you're still listening, I'm asking you don't stay silent. Speak. Even if your voice shakes. Even if you're misunderstood. Share what you know. Share what you feel. Plant seeds. Spark conversations. Pray boldly. Worship deeply. Protect the flame that's been reignited in you. And when you feel afraid, when you feel unworthy, when you feel alone, remember this. You are part of a prophecy unfolding in real time. And no matter what comes, you do not walk alone. The world is groaning. The systems are crumbling. The veils are tearing. And through the smoke and the shaking, a new sound is rising. A sound of remembrance. A sound of return. A sound of revival led by a people who were never meant to be forgotten. You are not just watching history, you are writing it. And heaven is watching, cheering, singing over you, saying, welcome back. You finally remember who you are.